You are listening to a story exclusively narrated on the Mafia Boss Love Story channel. Relax and step into the world of love stories filled with mystery, emotions, and passion. Don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment to support us. This content is the property of Mafia Boss Love Story. Please do not copy or re-upload it in any form. Elena Marchetti had learned, over 10 years of practice, that grief had a smell. Gunpowder and cold tile. Her mother's perfume mixing with copper. It was a smell that came back to her at strange hours, in the steam of her morning coffee, in the antiseptic hallway of her office building, in the particular grey light of November afternoons in Chicago, when the sky pressed low over the lake like a lid closing on a jar. She was thinking about that smell when the call came. It was 6:42 p.m, and she was the last one in her office on the 11th floor of a converted warehouse near the river, the kind of building developers liked to call boutique, because the word made exposed brick sound like a luxury instead of poor insulation. She had just finished writing up notes on a veteran named Marcus, who flinched every time a door closed too hard, and she was reaching for her bag when her cell phone buzzed against the desk with a number she didn't recognize. She almost didn't answer. She always almost didn't answer, and she always did. Because some old, stubborn part of her still believed that not picking up the phone was how people lost the people they loved. Dr. Marchetti? Doctor. The voice on the other end was a man's, low, careful, the kind of voice that had learned to sound calm because the alternative got people hurt. My name is Thomas Russo. I work for a client who needs your particular expertise. I apologize for the hour. I'm not taking new patients right now, she said, which was true, and which was also the sentence she used to buy herself 30 seconds to decide whether she was about to be threatened, propositioned, or simply annoyed. He's aware of your schedule. He's prepared to make it worth the inconvenience. A pause. The practiced pause of a man choosing his next words with the precision of someone laying out cutlery. Vincent Moretti would like to meet with you. Tonight, if possible. He's prepared to pay whatever your time is worth. Elena's hand went still on the strap of her bag. She knew the name, the way every adult in Chicago who read a newspaper knew the name. The way you knew the name of a hurricane that had passed through a few counties over and left behind a trail of stories nobody quite confirmed and nobody quite denied. Moretti. 3 generations of a family whose business interests were never written down plainly in any filing, whose name showed up in court documents only as an associate of, whose patriarch, Salvatore Moretti, had died of a heart attack 4 years ago in a hospital bed surrounded by men in good suits and bad intentions. I don't work with men like Vincent Moretti, she said, and was proud of how steady her voice came out. I understand the hesitation, Russo said, and there was something in his tone, not pleading exactly, but close to it, close enough that it made her pause again. I'd ask you to hear the nature of the request before you decide. It isn't what you think. I doubt that. He hasn't slept more than 2 hours at a stretch in 5 years, Doctor. He's seen 3 other specialists. None of them lasted longer than a single session. Russo's voice dropped, and for a moment the careful cadence cracked just slightly into something that sounded almost human. I've worked for this family a long time. I've never seen a man so afraid of his own mind. Elena closed her eyes. Outside her window, the lake had gone the colour of a healing bruise, purple-black under a sky that hadn't decided if it wanted to rain. She thought about Marcus and his flinching at doors. She thought about her own hands, 10 years ago, pressed against a wound that would not stop being wet, no matter how hard she pressed. And the silence after. The terrible, ringing silence that had replaced the sound of 3 gunshots in a diner on the south side. A silence she still heard sometimes in the gap between one heartbeat and the next. She had built her whole life as a fortress against violence. She had become an expert in trauma precisely so she would never again be its passenger, only its translator. The person standing on the shore, calling instructions to people drowning, never going into the water herself. "I'm not interested," she said. "He said you'd say that." A rustle of paper. "He told me to tell you this if you said no. That he isn't asking you to forgive what he's done, or to pretend he's anything other than what people say he is. He's only asking you to fix the part of him that won't let him close his eyes. He said if you can do that, if you can give him real sleep, the kind without the dreams, he'll walk away from everything. The business, the name, all of it. He has a reason now that he didn't have before." "Everyone has a reason," Eleanor said. "That's not new information." "His wife is 5 months pregnant," Russo said quietly. "He doesn't want his son inheriting what he inherited." Eleanor sat back down in her chair slowly, the way you sit down when your knees have made the decision before your mind has caught up. The office was very quiet. She could hear the building's heating system click on somewhere behind the walls, an old sound, a domestic sound, entirely at odds with the conversation she was having. She thought of all the reasons to say no. She thought of her training, her ethics board, the particular danger of treating someone whose patient history would never appear in any insurance database, whose triggers might include things she had spent her whole career trying to keep at a clinical distance. Men with guns, men who killed, the machinery of organized violence that had once, on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, taken her entire family from her in under 4 minutes. And she thought of the unborn child, a boy who didn't exist yet outside of a sentence on the phone, who might grow up free of all of it, or might not, depending on what she said next. "1 consultation," she heard herself say. "That's all I'm agreeing to. 1 conversation in a public place in daylight, and I decide after that whether there's anything further to discuss." "He won't agree to a public place," Russo said, almost apologetically. "Security concerns. But I can promise you safety. Whatever else you believe about this family, Doctor, we don't hurt the people he asks us to protect." "That's not reassuring." "No," Russo admitted. "I imagine it isn't." She drove to the address he gave her with the deliberate, controlled calm of a woman talking herself out of turning the car around 4 separate times. The building was on the Gold Coast, 60 floors of glass rising over Lakeshore Drive, the kind of address that didn't need a name on the awning because everyone who needed to know already knew. The doorman didn't ask her name. He simply nodded, as if her arrival had been expected with the same certainty as the tide, and pointed her toward a private elevator with no buttons except one. She rode up in silence, watching the city fall away beneath her through a wall of glass, the lake turning black and endless to the east, lights scattering across the grid of streets like something spilled and not yet cleaned up. Her reflection hovered in the glass, transparent, laid over the city like a ghost. 10 years ago, she had been a 26-year-old graduate student, eating dinner with her parents and her younger brother in a diner that had survived 3 decades and a dozen ownership changes. The kind of place that smelled like burnt coffee and felt like home. She remembered the bell over the door. She remembered her father laughing at something, his head thrown back, his hand reaching for the salt. She remembered the 3 men in ski masks, and after that, she remembered almost nothing at all that made narrative sense. Only fragments, sounds without sequence, the high whine in her ears that lasted for what felt like days, though the doctors told her later it had only been hours. The elevator chimed. The doors opened onto a foyer of dark wood and low light, and a man was waiting for her. Not Vincent Moretti, she understood immediately, but someone else, broad-shouldered, grey at the temples, his suit a size too careful to be anything but armour. Dr. Marchetti. He extended a hand. Thomas Russo. Thank you for coming. I haven't agreed to anything yet. I know. He said it kindly, which surprised her. He's through there. I'll be right outside if you need anything. She walked through the door he indicated into a room of floor-to-ceiling windows and very little furniture, the kind of space designed by someone who had once felt trapped and never wanted to feel that way again. And there, standing with his back to her at the window, looking down at the city like a man counting something he couldn't quite total, was Vincent Moretti. He turned around. And Elena Marchetti, who had spent 10 years building a life entirely insulated from violence, felt the floor of her certainty give way beneath her feet for the first time since the diner. He was not what she had pictured. She had pictured what? A caricature, probably. Gold rings, a scar, the kind of theatrical menace that made for good newspaper photographs. Instead, she found a man in a charcoal sweater and dark trousers, tall, lean in the way of someone who burned more than he ate, with a face that would have been beautiful if it weren't so tired. Dark hair, threaded early with grey at the temples, though he couldn't have been more than 34. Eyes the colour of strong tea, rimmed with the particular exhaustion that no amount of sleep could fix, because it wasn't sleep he was missing, it was rest, the kind that came from a mind finally believing it was safe. She knew that exhaustion. She had worn it herself once. Dr. Marchetti. His voice was quieter than she expected, almost gentle, with a low rasp underneath it, like gravel under silk. Thank you for coming. I wasn't sure you would. I'm not sure I should have. She didn't move further into the room. She kept the door at her back. An old habit, a survivor's habit. Always know where the exit is. Mr. Moretti, I want to be honest with you before this goes any further. I don't treat men in your line of work. I haven't in 10 years, and I won't start now, regardless of what you're offering. Something moved behind his eyes, not anger, she noted with surprise, but a kind of resigned recognition, as if he'd expected this exact sentence and had already grieved it before she'd said it. Rousseau told me you might say that. Then he should have told you not to waste an evening. He also told me you came anyway. Vincent gestured toward 2 chairs near the window, an invitation, not a command, and that distinction mattered to her more than she wanted to admit. Will you sit, at least? 5 minutes. If you still want to leave after that, I'll have someone drive you home myself, and you'll never hear from this family again. I give you my word, for whatever that's worth to you." "Probably very little." "Probably," he agreed, with the ghost of something that wasn't quite a smile. "But it's all I have to offer at the moment." She sat, not because she trusted him, she didn't, not yet, maybe not ever, but because some clinical, curious part of her, the part that had built an entire career out of understanding the architecture of fear, wanted to know what kind of nightmare kept a man like this awake. He sat across from her, elbows on his knees, hands loosely clasped, a posture she recognized immediately from 100 other patients, the posture of a man trying very hard to look like he wasn't holding himself together by force of will. "I'll tell you what I told the others," he said, "and then I'll tell you what I didn't tell them, because I think you're the kind of person who'd know if I was lying, and I'd rather not waste both our time." "Go on." "5 years ago, I did something." He said it plainly, without drama, the way a man describes weather rather than crime. "I'm not going to tell you the details tonight, maybe not ever, depending on what you decide. But since then, I haven't slept more than 2 hours without waking up. Sometimes it's gunfire, sometimes it's just—" He stopped, looked down at his hands as if they belonged to someone else. "Sometimes it's a sound, a particular sound, and I wake up and my heart is going like I've run 6 miles, and I can't get my breath, and I sit in the dark waiting for it to pass, and it doesn't pass. Not really. Not ever." "How long do the episodes last?" "Anywhere from 10 minutes to an hour. I've stopped trying to time them." "And during the day?" "During the day, I run a number of businesses that require a clear head and steady hands," he said, with a dryness that suggested he was aware of the irony. "I've gotten good at hiding it. I've gotten good at a lot of things." Elena studied him in the silence that followed, the clinical part of her mind sorting symptoms into categories, even as the rest of her remained wary, watchful, every nerve still humming with the old instinct to run from rooms that held men like this. Hypervigilance, intrusive memory, sleep disruption consistent with chronic severe PTSD, the kind that didn't come from a single trauma, but from years of accumulated violence, each incident layered over the last like sediment. "You said you did something 5 years ago," she said carefully. "Is that when this started?" "That's when it got bad." His jaw tightened. "It started before that, a long time before." "How long?" He looked at her then, really looked, for the first time since she'd walked in, and she felt the weight of his attention like a hand pressed flat against her sternum. "I was 16 the first time I killed someone, Doctor. You want to guess how long I've been having trouble sleeping?" The room went very still. Outside the window, the city carried on, indifferent, 1,000 lit windows holding 1,000 other lives that had nothing to do with this one. Elena felt something in her chest tighten. Not fear exactly, though fear was certainly present, sitting quietly at the back of her mind like an old dog that never fully slept. It was something closer to recognition. She knew what it was to carry a wound for 18 years. She knew the shape grief took when you tried to live a normal life around it, the way you learned to walk with a limp so practiced no one else could see it anymore. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "Most men in your position would lie, soften it, make themselves more sympathetic. Because if I lie to you, and you take this case anyway, you'll find out eventually, and then you'll leave, and I'll have wasted both our time for nothing." He leaned back, and for a moment the exhaustion in his face deepened into something almost unbearable to look at. I don't need you to think well of me, Dr. Marchetti. I need you to fix the part of my mind that won't let me rest. That's the whole of it. Everything else you can hate. I understand if you do. I don't hate you, she said, surprised to find it was true. I don't know you well enough yet to hate you. That's something, I suppose. What I do hate, she continued, is violence. All of it. The kind you've done, and the kind that's been done to you, and the kind that gets done to people who have nothing to do with either. I built my entire career around staying as far from it as I could manage. So you'll forgive me if I'm having trouble understanding why I'm sitting in this room. Something in his expression shifted. Curiosity, maybe, or the first real flicker of interest she'd seen in him, like he'd just noticed there was a second person in the conversation instead of only his own exhaustion. What happened to you? That's not relevant. It's relevant to me, he said quietly. You walked in here like someone counting exits. You sat with your back to the wall instead of the window. You've been watching my hands since you sat down, not my face. That's not professional caution, Doctor. That's something else. Elena's pulse spiked, a thin current of alarm running up through her chest. He was right. And the fact that he was right, the fact that this man, whom she'd known for less than 10 minutes, had read her body with the precision of a man who'd spent his whole life learning to read rooms for danger, frightened her more than anything he could have said about his own violence. I'm not here to be analysed, she said. No, he agreed. You're here because Rousseau told you about my son, and you couldn't say no to that, even though you wanted to. He watched her face for confirmation he didn't need, because he already had it. We have that in common, I think. Doing things we don't want to do, because the alternative is worse. Elena stood, suddenly needing the distance, and walked to the window herself, looking down at the river of headlights crawling along Lakeshore Drive. If I take this case, she said, with her back to him, there are conditions. I set the terms of treatment, not you. I decide the pace. You don't get to skip sessions because business calls, and you don't get to lie to me. Ever. About anything. Even the things that make you look unforgivable. The moment I think you're not being honest, I walk, and I don't come back, and no amount of money changes that. Agreed. And I won't be party to anything. I'm not your therapist and your alibi. I'm not a person you bring to dinners to make the family look respectable. I treat the symptoms of trauma. I'm not interested in anything else about your life. Understood. And the moment you put that child in danger by staying in this business one day longer than you have to, this is over. I mean that. I know. His voice, when she turned back to look at him, had gone rough at the edges, something raw breaking through the careful control. I've known that since the day she told me she was pregnant. I just didn't know how to stop. I've tried. You don't know how many times I've tried. Why not? Because men like my father don't let men like me walk away, he said. They let you retire when you're dead, Doctor. That's the only retirement this business offers. So I need you to fix what's broken in my head. And then I need to figure out how to stay alive long enough to use it. Elena looked at him for a long moment, at the grey in his hair too early for his age, the hands that didn't shake but looked like they were holding themselves still by force of will, the eyes that had seen things she could only imagine, and some things, perhaps, she didn't have to imagine at all. 3 sessions a week, she said finally. Here or somewhere private, never my office. I'll need a full clinical history, and I mean full, Mr. Moretti, not the version you'd give a priest. We start tomorrow. Something passed over his face that she would spend weeks afterward trying to name. Not relief, exactly. Something closer to disbelief. The look of a man who has spent so long bracing for refusal that acceptance lands like a blow instead of a gift. "Thank you," he said. "Don't thank me yet," Elena said. "You haven't met me as your doctor. You've only met me as a stranger who felt sorry for your unborn son. Those are different people, and the second one is going to make you work harder than you've ever worked for anything in your life." For the first time since she'd entered the room, Vincent Moretti smiled. Small, tired, but real. "Good," he said. "I was beginning to think no one was going to make me work for anything ever again." She came back the next evening at 7, against every instinct that told her to call Russo and cancel. She had spent the entire day rehearsing reasons to back out, a dozen of them, each more reasonable than the last, and had used none of them, because somewhere underneath the reasonable fear was a stubborn, unprofessional curiosity she didn't like admitting to herself. She wanted to know if she could fix him. She wanted to know what it would cost her to try. The penthouse looked different in the early evening light, gold instead of black, the windows holding the last burn of sunset over the lake like something on fire. Vincent was waiting for her in what she would come to think of as his real room. Not the sparse, performative space where he'd first met her, but a smaller study lined with books he had clearly read, not merely displayed, their spines cracked, their margins, she would learn later, filled with his handwriting. "You came," he said, and there was something almost boyish in his surprise, at odds with everything she knew about him. "I said I would. People say a lot of things to me they don't mean. I've stopped assuming otherwise." "I'm not most people," Elena said, setting her bag down and taking the chair she'd chosen the night before, the one with its back to the wall. "Let's begin. I need your full history, not just the trauma, everything. Where you were born, your parents, your earliest memories. Trauma doesn't exist in isolation, Mr. Moretti. I need to understand the whole architecture before I can find where it's cracked." "Vincent," he said, "if we're doing this 3 times a week, you can use my first name." "Vincent, then." She opened a notebook, not a tablet, not a recorder, because some of her older patients, the ones who'd survived true horror, flinched at the idea of their voices being kept on a device that could be hacked, stolen, subpoenaed. Paper felt safer. Paper could be burned. "Tell me about your father." His face changed instantly, a door closing somewhere behind his eyes. "That's a long conversation." "I have time." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the window, at the gold light fading slowly into blue. "Salvatore Moretti built this family out of nothing. Came over from Sicily at 19 with no money and a temper that scared even the men who were supposed to scare other people. By the time I was born, he owned half of the West Side, one way or another. Restaurants, construction, things that don't get written down. He was—" Vincent stopped, searching for the word. "Efficient. That's the best way I can describe him. He didn't believe in wasted motion. Wasted emotion, either." "And as a father?" "He believed weakness was a disease you caught from your mother if you weren't vaccinated against it early enough." Vincent's voice had gone flat, clinical, the voice of a man reciting facts about someone else's life. "My mother died when I was 7. Cancer, not anything more dramatic than that, though I think for years I half expected someone to tell me otherwise. That's the kind of family it was. You learned to suspect ordinary tragedy of being something else. After she died, he decided I needed toughening. I started going to the warehouse with him when I was 9. Not to do anything, just to watch. To learn what men in his business looked like when they thought no one decent was in the room. What did you see? Things a 9-year-old shouldn't see, Vincent said simply. I won't list them for you. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But I'll tell you this. By the time I was 12, I'd stopped being frightened by most of it. That's the part that should frighten you, Doctor. Not what I saw. How fast I stopped being afraid of it. Elena wrote nothing down for a moment, simply watching him. Letting the silence do the work, silence often did better than questions. And at 16? His jaw tightened. You want the story? I want whatever you're willing to give me. I'm not going to force anything out of you tonight. Trust isn't built in one session. But I need to know the shape of it, even if I don't have the details yet. There was a man, Vincent said after a long moment, his eyes fixed somewhere past her shoulder, somewhere that wasn't this room at all. He'd hurt someone in the family, a cousin of mine, 15 years old, a girl. My father decided the appropriate response was for me to be the one who delivered it. Not because I was the best choice, because he wanted to know if I had it in me, or if I was going to be soft, like my mother. And were you soft? No. The word came out like something physically painful to say. I wasn't soft. I did exactly what he asked, and I did it well. And I came home, and I didn't cry, and he told me he was proud of me. And that was the worst night of my life, Doctor. Worse than the thing itself. The moment my father told me he was proud. Because some small, ruined part of me felt good about it, wanted to hear it again. He looked at her then, his eyes hollow in a way that made her chest ache with something she refused to call sympathy. Not yet. Not when she'd known him for less than 24 hours. That's the thing nobody tells you about becoming a monster. It doesn't feel like falling. It feels like being held. Elena set her pen down. The clinical distance she'd built around herself, brick by brick, over a decade of careful practice, felt suddenly very thin, like wallpaper instead of wall. Vincent, I need you to understand something. What I'm about to say isn't absolution. I'm not in the business of forgiveness. That's not what therapy does, and it's not my place to offer it. But what your father did to you at 16 wasn't a measure of your character. It was a calculated act of psychological violence designed to bind you to him through shared guilt. He didn't make a soldier that night. He made a hostage. Doesn't change what I did. No, she agreed. It doesn't. You're responsible for your actions. I won't pretend otherwise. And I'd be doing you a disservice if I let you hide behind what was done to you as an excuse for everything that came after. But understanding why the trapdoor opened doesn't mean you have to keep falling through it for the rest of your life. That's what we're here to change. He looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable moving behind his eyes. Most people who find out what I am look at me like I'm something to be managed, or feared, or used. You're the first person in a long time who's looked at me like I'm something that can change. Everyone can change, Elena said. Whether they choose to is a different question. And if I don't choose to? If 5 years from now I'm still exactly what I am right now, just better rested? Then I'll have failed at half my job, she said honestly. But I don't think that's going to happen. Not because I think you're secretly good underneath all of it, some kind of fairy tale. Because I think you're tired, Vincent. Bone tired, in a way that goes past sleep. And tired people don't keep doing the thing that's wearing them down unless they believe there's no alternative. My job is to show you there's an alternative. He was quiet for a long time after that, and she let the silence stretch, watching the last of the gold light fade out of the windows, the city beginning to glitter into its nighttime self below them. "My son," Vincent said finally, very quietly. "I keep thinking about the first time he's old enough to ask me what I do. I don't know what I'm going to tell him." "What would you want to tell him?" "That his father builds things, not destroys them." He laughed, short and humorless. "I used to want to be an architect, you know, when I was a kid before all this. I used to draw buildings in the margins of my school books. My father found one once and told me dreams like that were for men who didn't have responsibilities." "You can still build things, Vincent," Helena said. "It's not too late for that. It's never too late for that. But you have to actually walk away first, not just talk about it, not just want it in the abstract. The wanting has to become a plan, and the plan has to become action. And that's going to be harder than anything you've done so far, including whatever happened when you were 16. "Harder than that?" "Different," she amended. "That took violence. This is going to take patience. I don't know which one is harder for you yet. We're going to find out." Her name was Sophia, and she was, Elena thought when she finally met her, exactly the kind of woman a man like Vincent Moretti would have been steered toward by people who understood the business of appearances. Beautiful in a composed, photographable way, gracious, sharp-eyed, 5 months pregnant, and carrying it with the kind of effortless elegance that made Elena, despite herself, feel slightly underdressed in her own work clothes. They met in the penthouse kitchen, a vast marble space that looked like it had been styled for a magazine and used for almost nothing on Elena's 4th visit. Sophia was making tea, her dark hair pulled back, a silk robe over leggings, and she looked up when Elena entered with an expression that was polite, careful, and entirely unreadable. "You're the doctor," Sophia said. It wasn't a question. "Elena Marchetti." "Sophia." She didn't offer her hand. And Elena understood, in the small space of that omission, that this woman had decided something about her already, and was waiting to see if it would be confirmed or contradicted. "Vincent told me he found someone. He didn't tell me she'd be so young." "I'm 36, Elena said evenly. "I don't think that qualifies as young in most contexts. In this family, everyone over 40 was raised to think anyone under that is a child." Something almost like humour flickered across Sophia's face, gone as quickly as it came. "Is it working? Whatever you're doing with him?" "It's early. These things take time." "He slept through one night in the last 6 weeks, Sophia said, and for the first time her composure cracked slightly, revealing something more raw underneath. Exhaustion of her own, the particular fatigue of loving someone whose pain you couldn't reach, no matter how close you slept beside them. Just one. Do you know what that's like? Lying next to someone for years and watching them fight something invisible every single night, and there's nothing you can do but hold his hand until it passes." "I can imagine," Elena said quietly, and meant it more than Sophia could have known. "He won't tell me what happened to him. Not the details. I've stopped asking. Sophia poured hot water over the tea leaves, her movements precise, controlled. A woman who had learned long ago that control was the only thing this world reliably let her keep. I used to think if I loved him enough, it would be enough to fix it. I know now that's not how it works. Love isn't medicine, Dr. Marchetti, whatever the songs say. No, Elena agreed. It isn't. But it can be part of the environment that makes healing possible. I'm not here to replace what you give him. I'm here to do something different, something more clinical, more deliberate. Think of me as someone repairing the foundation so the house you've built together has somewhere stable to stand. Sophia studied her for a long moment, and Elena had the distinct sense of being assessed by someone whose entire life had trained her to read people quickly and accurately, the way you learn a language out of necessity rather than love. He told me about the promise, that if you can fix his sleep, he'll leave the business. He did. Do you believe him? Elena hesitated, surprised by the directness of the question, and more surprised by how much she wanted to answer it honestly rather than diplomatically. I believe he wants to. I believe the want is real. Whether wanting translates into doing, that's a different question. And I think you already know the answer better than I do. I've heard him want things before, Sophia said softly. I've watched him want things with his whole chest and still not be able to reach them, because this family doesn't let go of its own that easily. You should understand what you've walked into, Doctor. This isn't a love story where the bad man becomes good because a good woman believes in him. This is a business with shareholders, and some of those shareholders would rather see Vincent dead than see him walk away with everything he knows. I'm not here for a love story, Elena said, more sharply than she intended. I'm his therapist, nothing more. Sophia's eyes moved over her face with an expression Elena couldn't quite name. Not suspicion exactly, but something close to it, something that looked almost like recognition, as if Sophia had seen this particular configuration of denial before and knew exactly where it led. Of course, she said, in a tone that suggested she believed precisely none of it. Well, I hope you can help him. God knows I haven't been able to, not in 5 years of trying. She left the kitchen with her tea, robe trailing behind her, and Elena stood alone in the marble silence for a long moment, feeling something uncomfortable settle in her chest. Not guilt, not yet, because she had done nothing to feel guilty about, but a kind of warning, a small, cold note, sounding somewhere beneath her ribs, telling her that Sophia Moretti had seen something in her that Elena herself wasn't ready to look at directly. She found Vincent in his study an hour later, surrounded by ledgers he wasn't reading, staring at nothing. You met Sophia, he said without looking up. I did. She doesn't trust easily. Don't take it personally. She doesn't have to trust me, Eleanor said, sitting across from him, opening her notebook. She just has to let me do my job. How did the breathing exercises go this week? Better. He rubbed a hand over his face. Tuesday night, I made it almost 4 hours before it woke me up. That's progress. Real progress, Vincent. She watched him carefully. Tell me about the dream, the recurring one. You've mentioned it twice now without describing it. His hands stilled on the desk. It's not always the same, but there's a version that comes back more than the others. He took a breath, the kind of breath a man takes before stepping into cold water. I'm in a room. I don't recognize it, but in the dream I know it, the way you know things in dreams without being told. There's a man in front of me, And I have a gun, and I know I'm supposed to use it, and I know if I don't, something worse happens to someone I love. So I do it. Every time. I do it, and then I look down, and it's not the man anymore. It's my son. Elena's pen stopped moving. He's not born yet. I know. Vincent's voice cracked, just slightly, on the second word. I know that. But in the dream, I know him completely. His face, the sound of his voice, the exact weight of him in my arms. And I've killed him, Doctor. I've killed him with my own hands. And I wake up and it takes me 20 minutes to remember he isn't even born yet, that it was never real, and somehow that doesn't make it better. It makes it worse. Because some part of me believes I'm going to find a way to do it for real. Not with a gun, just by being who I am near him. That's called anticipatory guilt, Eleanor said gently, though her chest ached at the rawness in his voice. It's common in people who've caused harm and are now responsible for protecting someone vulnerable. Your mind is trying to process the fear that history repeats itself, that violence is a pattern you'll pass down whether you intend to or not. The dream isn't a prophecy, Vincent. It's a warning your own conscience is giving you. The fact that you're horrified by it, the fact that it haunts you instead of feeling natural to you, that's the proof you're not your father. Your father would never have had that dream. He wouldn't have had the conscience required to generate it. He looked up at her, and there was something so naked in his expression, something so far from the cold, dangerous man the newspapers implied, the man Rousseau had described, the man whose name made grown men in this city lower their voices, that Elena had to look down at her notebook to keep from reaching across the desk and putting her hand over his. You're the only person who's ever said something like that to me and made it sound true, he said. It is true, she said. That's why it sounds that way. 3 weeks into treatment, Rousseau called her with an unusual request. Would she be willing to observe Vincent in a social setting, to better understand his triggers in environments closer to his daily life? It wasn't standard practice. She told him so twice, but there was something to the logic of it that she couldn't entirely dismiss. Trauma responses didn't live in quiet studies. They lived in crowded rooms, in sudden sounds, in the press of bodies and the particular electric tension of spaces where danger and pleasure sat too close together. The club was called Nero, and it occupied the ground floor of a building the Morettis owned outright on the edge of River North, all black marble and low gold light, the kind of place where the drinks cost more than most people's car payments, and the clientele understood, without being told, that certain corners of the room were not for casual conversation. Elena arrived in a dress she'd bought for the occasion, dark green, simple, nothing that screamed for attention, though she would later learn that nothing she wore that night went unnoticed by the man she'd come to observe. She found Vincent at a private table on the upper level, overlooking the floor, Rousseau a discreet distance away, near the stairs. 2 other men she didn't recognize, stationed near the exits, with the particular stillness of men whose job was watching rather than dancing. Doctor. Vincent stood as she approached, and something in his eyes shifted when he saw her. A flicker of warmth quickly schooled into something more neutral. I wasn't sure you'd actually come. I said I would. She sat across from him, declining the champagne a waiter offered with a small shake of her head. I'm here to observe, not to socialize. I need to see how you function in a high-stimulation environment. Crowds, noise, unpredictability, these are common trigger conditions for people with your symptom profile. Always the doctor, he said, but there was no edge in it, only something that sounded almost fond. She watched him for the next hour with clinical attention, cataloguing the small tells most people would never notice. The way his eyes swept the room every few minutes in a pattern too practiced to be conscious, counting exits, counting faces. The way his shoulders tightened almost imperceptibly when a group of men entered through the side door, relaxing only once Rousseau had confirmed with a small nod that they were known, expected, safe. The way he never once let his back face the room. "You haven't relaxed since I sat down," she observed. "I don't relax in rooms like this. Haven't in years." "Even though it's your own club, full of your own men?" "Especially then," he said low. "The people who'd hurt me aren't strangers, Doctor. They're never strangers. That's the first thing this life teaches you. The man who smiles at you across the room tonight might be the one who puts a bullet in you next year if the math changes enough. You learn to watch everyone, even the ones who love you." "That sounds exhausting." "It is." He looked at her, and something in his gaze sharpened, focused entirely on her in a way that made her suddenly uncomfortably aware of her own pulse. "You're the only person in this room I'm not watching for danger." The statement landed harder than she expected, and she had to look away from him, down at the dance floor below, where bodies moved together under shifting light, oblivious to the careful architecture of threat and protection surrounding the table above them. "That's not a healthy dynamic, Vincent. I'm your therapist." "I know what you are." His voice had gone quieter, rougher. "Doesn't change what I said." Before she could respond, there was a disturbance near the bar. Raised voices, the scrape of a stool, the particular electric shift in a room's energy that precedes violence, the way static precedes lightning. Elena's whole body went rigid before her mind caught up, an old, primal response activating faster than thought. Scan for exits, scan for weapons, find cover. Vincent was on his feet instantly, his hand closing around her wrist, not roughly, but with absolute certainty, pulling her back from the railing and positioning his own body slightly in front of hers, a movement so natural and unconscious it took her a moment to understand what he'd done. "Stay behind me," he said, low and flat, all the warmth gone from his voice, replaced by something colder, harder, a version of him she hadn't seen before, and that frightened her in a way she didn't expect, not because it threatened her, but because she could see, even in that single charged moment, that this was the man the newspapers wrote about, the man capable of the things he'd described in his 16th year. The disturbance resolved itself within seconds. 2 drunk men, a spilled drink, Rousseau and another man moving in with the easy authority of bouncers who'd done this 1,000 times. But Vincent didn't release her wrist for a long moment after, didn't lower his guard until he'd confirmed with his own eyes that the threat, such as it was, had passed. "It was nothing," she said softly, once the room had settled back into its normal rhythm. "Just 2 drunk men." "I know." His hand was still around her wrist, his thumb resting against her pulse point, and she wondered if he could feel how fast it was racing, and for what reason. Fear? Or something else entirely? Something she didn't want to name. "Doesn't change what my body does. I see danger, and I move toward it, not away. That's not a skill I can turn off, because the threat turned out to be small." "That's called hypervigilance," Elena said, though her voice came out less steady than she wanted. "It's a textbook trauma response." "Is that what this is?" He finally released her wrist, but he didn't step back, and they stood close enough that she could smell him. Cedar and something darker underneath, gunmetal and good cologne. an unsettling combination that her body responded to before her mind had a chance to object. Because it didn't feel like a textbook anything, Doctor. It felt like the only clear thought I've had all night was making sure nothing got near you. Vincent, I know, he said, before she could finish the sentence, stepping back finally, putting professional distance between them with visible effort. I know what you're going to say. I'm your patient, you're my doctor, there are lines. He looked at her for a long moment, something raw and unguarded passing across his face before he shuttered it again. I'm not going to cross them. I just need you to know I see them. I see them every time I'm in a room with you, and it's getting harder, not easier, to remember why they're there. Elena said nothing, because there was nothing professional to say, and the unprofessional thing rising in her chest, something warm and frightened and entirely unwelcome, was not something she was prepared to give voice to. Not that night, not in a nightclub, with her heart still hammering from adrenaline that had nothing to do with the two drunk men at the bar. I should go, she said finally. I'll have Russo drive you. That's not necessary. It is to me, Vincent said, and something in his voice made it clear the conversation was over, that this was not a man accustomed to losing arguments about the safety of people he'd decided to protect, regardless of what professional title separated them. Please, let me do this much. She let him, because arguing felt suddenly like more effort than it was worth, and because some traitorous part of her, the part she'd spent 10 years training into silence, did not actually want to refuse. The breakthrough, when it came sideways, the way breakthroughs in trauma therapy almost always did, arriving not through the door you'd been watching, but through a window you'd forgotten to lock. It was a Tuesday, their 6th week of treatment, and Elena had arrived to find Vincent unusually quiet, sitting in his study with the lights dimmed, a single lamp casting everything in amber, his hands wrapped around a glass of water he wasn't drinking. Bad night? She asked, settling into her chair. Bad week. He looked up at her, and the exhaustion in his face had a different quality than usual. Not the chronic, grinding fatigue she'd come to recognize, but something sharper, more recent. I didn't sleep at all last night, not even the 2 hours. What happened? He was quiet for a long moment, turning the glass in his hands. There was a meeting yesterday, with some of the men my father used to work with, men who report to my uncle now since my father died. They wanted to discuss expansion into territory we've stayed out of for years, territory that would mean more violence, more exposure, more risk. His jaw worked. I told them no. I told them I was moving the family in a different direction, that I wanted to wind down the more dangerous parts of the operation over the next year. How did that go? About as well as you'd imagine. His voice had gone flat, careful, the voice of a man describing something he was still processing. My Uncle Dominic didn't say much. He's not a man who shows his hand easily. But I could see it in his eyes, Doctor. The moment I said the word winding down, something in him decided I was a problem instead of family. That's how this business works. The moment you become inconvenient, the math starts running on whether you're worth more alive or dead. Elena felt the cold weight of that statement settle in her stomach. Vincent, if you're in danger, I'm always in danger, he said simply. That's not new information. What's new is that now the danger has a reason to come from inside the house instead of outside it. He set the glass down, and his hands, she noticed, were not quite steady. I keep telling myself I made the right choice, saying it out loud to them, starting the process instead of just thinking about it forever. But last night, lying there, I kept replaying my uncle's face, and every scenario my mind could generate of how this goes wrong started looking like the dream, the one I told you about. With your son. With my son. He looked at her, and there was something almost pleading in his expression, a vulnerability she hadn't seen from him before, not even in their earliest sessions. I don't know how to make my body believe I made the right choice, when every instinct I've spent 20 years building is screaming that I just signed a death warrant. Can I try something with you? Elena asked, leaning forward. It's not something we've done yet. It's more direct than the exercises I've given you. It asks your body to process the memory itself, rather than just managing the symptoms around it. But I think you might be ready, and I think it might help with exactly what you're describing. What is it? Eye movement desensitization. It's a technique for processing traumatic memories that have become stuck, frozen in the nervous system in a way that keeps replaying the danger long after the actual threat has passed. I'd ask you to recall a specific memory while following a guided movement pattern with your eyes. It sounds strange, I know, but the evidence behind it is substantial, particularly for combat veterans and survivors of violence. It works by helping the brain finally file the memory away as past instead of present. Vincent was quiet for a moment. What memory? That's up to you. But I'd suggest starting with the night you were 16, the one you've described to me in pieces, but never let yourself fully sit with. His face went pale, the first time she'd seen real fear in him rather than exhaustion. I don't know if I can do that. You don't have to do it tonight, Elena said gently. We can wait. We can build toward it slowly. But I want you to know it's there, when you're ready. And I think it might be the key to actually closing the door on this, instead of just managing the draft coming through it. He sat with that for a long time, the amber lamplight carving shadows into the planes of his face, and when he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Stay with me while I try. Tonight. I don't think I can do it alone, and I don't think I can do it with anyone else in this house. I'll stay, Elena said, and meant it more deeply than the sentence should have allowed for a woman whose entire professional identity was built on careful distance. She walked him through the protocol slowly, grounding him first, establishing safety cues, a phrase he could return to if the memory became too overwhelming, a physical anchor in his own palm he could press to remind his nervous system that he was here, now, safe, not there, then, in danger. When she finally asked him to bring the memory forward, she watched his whole body change, his breath going shallow, his hands curling into fists on his knees. I'm in the warehouse, he said, his voice gone distant, a boy's voice somehow audible underneath the man's. It's cold. I remember it being cold, even though it was August. My father's hand on my shoulder, pushing me forward. The man on his knees in front of me. I can't see his face anymore. Isn't that strange? I used to see it every night, and now I can't. And someone hands me the gun. And it's heavier than I expect, heavier than I think a gun should be. And my father says, "Finish it." And I... He stopped, his breath coming hard, his hand pressing white-knuckled into his own palm. You're safe, Elena said softly, steady, an anchor in the room. You're 34 years old. You're in your home. That was 18 years ago. It's over. You survived it. Keep going if you can. It took nearly 40 minutes, the memory circling and breaking and reforming, grief finally arriving where only numbness had lived for almost 2 decades. And when it was over, Vincent Moretti, a man who had killed without flinching, who commanded fear from grown men twice his size, who had built a fortress so complete around his own pain that even he had forgotten there was a person trapped inside it, put his face in his hands and wept like the 16-year-old boy he had never been allowed to be. Elena did not move to comfort him with her hands, because that was not what the moment called for. Not yet. Not within the careful architecture of what they were supposed to be to each other. But she stayed, close enough that her presence itself was the comfort, and when he finally looked up, his face raw and unguarded in a way she suspected almost no one alive had ever seen, something passed between them that neither of them had a clinical word for. "Thank you," he said, his voice wrecked. "I don't know how to thank you for that." "You don't have to," she said. "This is the work. You did the hard part. I just held the door open." "No," he said, looking at her with an intensity that made her chest ache. "You did more than that. You're the first person who ever made me believe the door could open at all." Russo found her in the elevator lobby a week later, his expression grave in a way she hadn't seen before, and she knew immediately something had shifted. "Dr. Marchetti, do you have a moment?" "Of course." He glanced toward the penthouse door, then back at her, lowering his voice. "I want to tell you something, and I want you to understand I'm telling you because I think you deserve to know what you've walked into, not because anyone asked me to warn you off." "Go ahead." "Vincent's uncle, Dominic, came to see him yesterday while you were out." Russo's jaw tightened. It wasn't a friendly visit. Dominic spent the last 4 years effectively running the day-to-day operations while Vincent dealt with— He gestured vaguely, encompassing, she understood, the entirety of Vincent's trauma, the years of barely functioning grief that had left room for someone else to consolidate power. Dominic doesn't want Vincent stepping back into full control, and he definitely doesn't want him walking away entirely. A weakened, unstable Vincent suits Dominic's interests. A healed, decisive Vincent, who's planning to dismantle parts of the operation, does not. Eleanor felt a cold weight settle in her stomach. "Are you telling me I'm a target?" "I'm telling you that you're a variable Dominic didn't account for, and men like Dominic don't like variables they can't control." Russo's eyes were steady, serious. "I'm not saying he'll move against you directly. That would be clumsy, and Dominic isn't a clumsy man. But I'd ask you to be careful. Vary your routes home. Don't establish predictable patterns. And if anything feels wrong, anything at all, call me before you call the police. The police can't help you with this family. I can." "That's not exactly reassuring, Mr. Russo." "No," he admitted, "it isn't. But it's honest, and I think you've earned honesty, given what you're doing for him." He hesitated, something almost paternal entering his expression. "I've worked for this family 18 years, Doctor. I watched Vincent grow up in it. I was there the night his father took him to the warehouse. I didn't agree with it then, and I've never agreed with it since. But a man in my position doesn't get to have opinions that contradict Salvatore Moretti. Not if he wants to keep breathing. I've watched Vincent carry that night like a stone in his chest for 18 years. I've never seen him put any of it down until you walked in. Whatever you're doing in there, it's working. I'd hate to see anything stop it." Elena absorbed that, the weight of it, the strange responsibility of being told by a man who had clearly seen real violence that her presence in this building had become consequential beyond the clinical scope she'd tried so carefully to maintain. "I appreciate you telling me. I'll be careful. There's one more thing." Russo's voice dropped further. "Dominic asked about you, specifically. Asked who you were, why Vincent trusted you so completely, whether there was something between you beyond the professional arrangement. I told him no. I'd ask you to make sure that's still true, Doctor, for your own safety as much as anything. Men like Dominic look for leverage. If he comes to believe Vincent's feelings for you run deeper than a doctor-patient relationship, that becomes a weapon he can use against both of you." The word feelings landed in her chest like a stone dropped into still water, ripples spreading out long after the impact. She thought of Vincent's hand around her wrist at the club, the way his eyes had found hers across crowded rooms in the weeks since, the rawness of his face after the EMDR session, the things he'd said and the things he'd very carefully not said but had let her see anyway. "There's nothing between us beyond the professional arrangement," she said, and hated how much effort it took to make the words sound true. Russo looked at her for a long moment, and whatever he saw in her face, he was too discreet a man to comment on it. "Good," he said simply. "Keep it that way, Doctor, for both your sakes." He left her standing in the elevator lobby, the gold light fading toward evening through the windows, and Elena stood very still for a long moment, feeling the careful architecture of her professional distance, built so painstakingly over 6 weeks, crack just slightly at the foundation. Not because of anything Russo had said about danger, though that frightened her too, but because of the truth underneath his warning, the thing she had been refusing to look at directly since the moment Vincent Moretti had turned around at that window, and she had felt the floor of her certainty give way. She was falling for her patient. The realization landed with the cold clarity of a diagnosis, undeniable once named, and she stood there in the elevator lobby of a penthouse owned by a man whose family had been built on violence, feeling 10 years of careful self-protection beginning, slowly and irreversibly, to come undone. She almost didn't go back the next evening. She sat in her car outside her apartment for 20 minutes, engine off, hands on the wheel, running through every argument her training had ever given her for why this needed to stop. Countertransference, boundary violation, the particular danger of falling for a man whose business was violence when her entire life's work had been built on escaping violence's gravity. She had survivors in her practice who would understand instantly what she was doing, recognizing the magnetic, irrational pull toward danger that sometimes followed trauma, the way some part of the wounded mind sought out the very thing that had hurt it, as if mastering it now might undo the powerlessness of before. She was not supposed to be that patient. She was supposed to be the doctor, and yet. She thought of his face after the EMDR session, raw and unguarded, the 16-year-old boy finally allowed to grieve. She thought of his hand around her wrist at the club, certain and protective, not possessive in the way she'd have flinched from, but in a way that had made her feel, for the first time in a decade, something other than alone in a room full of danger. She thought of the unborn child, whose entire future rested in some measure on whether she walked back into that building or drove home and never returned his calls. She went back. He was waiting for her in the study, and something in his face when she walked in told her he'd half expected her not to come. The same flicker of disbelief she'd seen in their very first meeting, the look of a man perpetually bracing for the door to close. "I need to say something," she said, before she lost her nerve, before the careful, clinical sentences she'd rehearsed in the car could dissolve into something less professional. "And I need you to let me finish before you respond." "Okay." "Rousseau spoke to me yesterday about Dominic, about the danger I might be in." She made herself meet his eyes, made herself hold steady. "And in the course of that conversation, he asked me something that I lied about, Vincent. And I think you deserve to know that I lied. Because lying to you about this feels like exactly the kind of thing I told you on the first night that I would never do." His expression had gone very still, very focused. "What did you lie about?" He asked if there was anything between us beyond the professional arrangement. Her voice was steadier than she expected, though her heart was not. "I told him no. That wasn't true. I don't know what to call what's between us, and I'm not going to pretend I do. But it isn't nothing, and pretending it's nothing isn't fair to either of us, and it isn't safe either, given what Rousseau told me about Dominic looking for leverage." The silence that followed felt enormous, the whole weight of the city pressing against the windows, the gold light fading into the particular blue of a Chicago evening in early spring. "I've known since the club," Vincent said finally, his voice rough. "Since I put my hand on you, and some part of me that's been dead for 20 years woke up and decided you were the only thing in the room worth protecting." He looked at her, and the careful control he wore like armour in every other context of his life had fallen away entirely, leaving something younger, more exposed. "I haven't said anything because I know exactly what it costs you to be here. I know what it would mean if I made this harder than it already is. You came into my life to fix something broken, not to become another thing I break." "You haven't broken anything," Eleanor said, though her voice wavered now. "That's the problem, Vincent. If you were even half the man the newspapers describe, this would be simple. I'd have a name for what I'm feeling, and that name would be mistake. And I'd walk out of here and never come back, and in 6 months it would just be a strange story I told no one." She swallowed hard. "But you're not that man. Or you are, and you're also 100 other things. A boy who never got to grieve, a husband who sits awake all night so his wife doesn't have to face this alone, a father who's terrified of becoming his own father, a man who held my wrist at a nightclub because some old wound in him couldn't bear the thought of anything getting near me. I don't know how to hate the parts of you that scare me, without losing the parts of you I—" She stopped herself, the word sitting unsaid in the air between them, both of them hearing it anyway. "Say it," Vincent said quietly. "Please, I need to hear you say it, even if nothing comes of it, even if this is the only time either of us ever says it out loud." "I think I'm falling in love with you," Eleanor said, the words landing in the quiet room like something dropped from a great height, irreversible the moment they left her mouth. "And I think that's the single most unethical, unprofessional, dangerous thing I've ever allowed myself to feel. And I don't know what to do about it. Because every part of my training says I should walk away right now and never look back. And every part of everything else in me doesn't want to move from this chair. Vincent crossed the room before she'd finished speaking, kneeling in front of her chair so they were at eye level, his hands hovering near hers without quite touching, asking permission with the restraint of a man who had spent his whole life taking what he wanted and was, for the first time, choosing not to. Elena. Her name in his mouth sounded different than it ever had from anyone else, weighted, deliberate, like something he'd been saving. I am not going to pretend I haven't wanted to touch you since the first night you walked into this room and looked at me like I was a person instead of a headline. But I need you to know, if we do this, if we let this become something, I am not going to let it cost you your safety, your career, or your life. Whatever happens between us happens after I've gotten out, not before. I won't have you anywhere near the part of my life that could hurt you. That's not a decision you get to make alone, Elena said softly. I'm not a child who needs protecting from her own choices, Vincent. I've spent 10 years rebuilding myself after violence took everything from me. I know exactly what danger costs. I'm choosing this with my eyes open. Then let me finish what I started, he said, his voice low, urgent. Let me get this family out of my hands the right way, the safe way. And then let me come to you as a man with nothing to offer but himself. No danger attached, no Dominic, no business, nothing but a life I'm trying to build into something worth having. Give me that, Elena. Let this... He gestured between them, the charged space that had opened up. Wait just long enough for me to make it safe to exist. And until then? Until then, he said, finally letting his hand close over hers, warm and certain. We keep doing the work. We keep being exactly as careful as we need to be. And we don't pretend this isn't real. Because I think the pretending is what almost cost us both something honest. His thumb moved gently over her knuckles. I've spent 18 years being told what I am by men who only ever saw the worst of me. You're the first person who looked at all of it, the worst and whatever's left underneath, and didn't flinch. I'm not giving that up because it's inconvenient or dangerous. I've survived plenty of both. Elena looked at their joined hands, at the lines etched into his knuckles, scars she hadn't asked about yet, hadn't earned the right to ask about, perhaps, until tonight. Okay, she said softly. We wait. But Vincent, the moment this becomes more dangerous than either of us can manage, we stop pretending waiting is the same as safe. Promise me that. I promise, he said, and for the first time since she'd known him, she believed a promise from this man completely, without reservation. The way she hadn't let herself believe anything, since a diner on the South Side 18 years ago had taught her that promises were only as strong as the world's willingness to honour them. 3 days later, Sophia called her directly, a number Elena hadn't given her, which meant she'd gotten it from Vincent or Russo, a detail that registered as significant even before Sophia spoke. Can you meet me? Sophia's voice was tight, careful. Not at the penthouse, somewhere neutral. They met at a small cafe on the north side, far enough from the Gold Coast that the clientele looked at neither of them with any particular recognition. Just two women drinking coffee on an ordinary Thursday afternoon. Sophia looked tired in a way Elena hadn't seen before. The composed elegance from their first meeting worn thin at the edges. I know, Sophia said, without preamble, once they'd settled into a corner booth. About you and Vincent. I've known for 2 weeks, maybe longer. I'm not stupid, Dr. Marchetti, whatever else you might think of me. Elena's stomach dropped. The careful structure of restraint she and Vincent had built together suddenly feeling fragile, exposed. Sophia, nothing has happened between us. We've been— I know that too, Sophia interrupted, not unkindly. I know my husband. I know what kind of man he is when he's decided to do the right thing instead of the easy thing. And from what I can see, that's exactly what he's doing with you. Waiting, being careful. It would almost be funny if it weren't so sad, watching two people clearly in love perform this elaborate dance of professional distance because they're both too principled to just admit it. I don't know what you want me to say. I don't want you to say anything. Sophia wrapped her hands around her coffee cup, and Elena noticed for the first time the tremor in them, small but real. I want to tell you something, and then I want you to understand why I'm telling you, because I think you deserve the context before you decide what to do with any of this. Go ahead. Vincent and I were never in love, Sophia said simply. Not the way you're thinking. Our marriage was arranged, not in the old world formal sense, but practically. That's what it was. My family runs legitimate businesses that needed protection his family could offer. His family needed the appearance of respectability my family could lend. We were both 26, both tired of being told who to be, and we found in each other something that looked enough like partnership to make the arrangement bearable. She looked up, and there was no bitterness in her expression, only a kind of weary honesty. I care for him, deeply. He's been kind to me in ways this world doesn't make easy. But I have never been in love with Vincent Moretti. And I don't believe, in 5 years of marriage, he has ever once been in love with me. Elena sat very still, absorbing this, the careful architecture of guilt she'd been carrying since the conversation in Vincent's study, shifting under the weight of new information. Does he know that's how you feel? He's known since the wedding, Sophia said. We've never pretended otherwise with each other. It's one of the few honest things in our marriage, the mutual understanding that we were building something out of necessity, not romance, and that we'd both find a way to be content with that, because the alternative options available to people like us were considerably worse. She paused. What's changed is the baby. I love this child already, more than I've loved almost anything in my life. And I want him to grow up somewhere safe, away from this family, away from the violence, away from everything Vincent has spent 5 years trying to escape in his own mind every night. If you are the thing that finally gets him out, if loving you is what finally makes him brave enough to walk away from everything his father built, then I am not your obstacle, Doctor Marchetti. I am, God help me, your ally. Sophia, I never meant for this to happen. I want you to know that. I came into this as his doctor, and I never intended— I believe you, Sophia said, with surprising gentleness. And for what it's worth, I think you're good for him. I've watched him for 5 years sleepwalk through his own life, holding himself together with sheer force of will, and in the last 2 months, I've seen something in him I haven't seen since before his father died. Hope, maybe, or the beginning of it. She finished her coffee, set the cup down with quiet precision. What I need from you isn't to step away. What I need is for both of you to be careful. Genuinely careful, not performatively careful. Because if Dominic discovers this before Vincent has fully secured his exit, It won't just be Vincent's life at risk. It will be yours, and it will be this child's. And I am not interested in losing either of you to protect a romance neither of you asked for, but both of you, I think, deserve. Elena reached across the table, an instinct she didn't fully examine, and took Sophia's hand. Thank you for trusting me with this. I'm not doing it for you, Sophia said, though her fingers tightened around Elena's briefly before she withdrew. I'm doing it for him, and for this baby, and for the very small, very stubborn part of me that still believes some people deserve to escape the lives they were born into. She stood, gathering her coat. Get him out, Dr. Marchetti, whatever it takes. I'll do whatever I can on my end to help. But get him out, before Dominic decides the cost of letting him try is higher than the cost of stopping him. Elena met Dominic Moretti for the first time 2 weeks later, and the meeting was not one she had requested, nor one Vincent had arranged. It happened by what felt, in the moment, like accident, though she would later come to understand that very little in that family ever happened by accident. She was leaving the penthouse building through the underground garage, a habit Rousseau had recommended for security reasons, when a black sedan pulled up beside her own car and a man stepped out, tall, silver-haired, dressed with the same careful expense as Vincent, but wearing it differently, like a costume rather than a second skin. Dr. Marchetti. His voice was smooth, cultured, entirely without the warmth that sometimes softened Vincent's. I've been hoping to make your acquaintance. Dominic Moretti. Elena's pulse spiked, but she kept her face neutral, her hand steady on her car keys. Mr. Moretti, I wasn't aware we had business to discuss. Perhaps we don't. Perhaps I simply wanted to meet the woman who's made such an impression on my nephew. His eyes moved over her with the cool, assessing quality of a man pricing an asset. He speaks of you, you know. Not often, and never directly to me, but men in this family talk, and word travels. They say you've changed him, made him soft. I've helped him manage a serious psychological condition, Elena said evenly. I don't know what soft means in the context you're using it. Soft means a man who used to make decisions with his head now makes them with sentiment, Dominic said, his smile never reaching his eyes. Soft means a man who used to understand that this family's survival depends on strength, now talks about winding down operations, as if we're a struggling restaurant, instead of an empire that's taken 3 generations to build. Soft, Doctor, is dangerous, not just to him, to everyone whose livelihood depends on this family remaining strong. I'm not in the business of family politics, Mr. Moretti. I treat trauma. What your nephew chooses to do with his life once he's no longer drowning in panic attacks and insomnia is his decision, not mine. Is it? Dominic stepped closer, and though he made no overtly threatening movement, something in his proximity made every instinct in Elena's body sharpen to a fine point. Forgive me if I find that difficult to believe, given the timeline. 5 years of failed treatment, 3 other specialists who couldn't move the needle, and then you arrive. And within 2 months, my nephew is sitting across from men who've served this family for decades, telling them he intends to dismantle everything his grandfather and father built. That's not coincidence, Doctor. That's influence. And I find myself wondering what kind of influence a therapist exerts over a patient to produce results like that. The kind that comes from actually treating the underlying condition instead of letting it fester for 5 years, Elena said, her voice sharper than she intended, anger cutting through the fear. If you have concerns about your nephew's business decisions, Mr. Moretti, I'd suggest you take them up with him directly. I'm not a part of this family, and I have no interest in becoming one. And yet you spend 3 evenings a week in his penthouse, Dominic said softly, alone with him for hours at a time, a pregnant wife in the next room. I wonder what Sophia thinks of these arrangements. The implication landed like a slap, deliberate and precise, and Elena understood in that moment exactly what kind of man she was dealing with. Not a brute, not someone who solved problems with violence as his first instinct, but someone far more dangerous. A man who understood that the most effective weapon against people like her and Vincent wasn't a gun, but information, suspicion, the slow poisoning of trust. I think, Elena said carefully, that you're trying to manufacture a scandal because you're afraid of losing the power you've consolidated while your nephew was too sick to claim it himself. I think you'd rather he stay broken, Mr. Moretti, because a broken man is easier to control than a healed one. And I think you should be very careful about what accusations you make to a therapist who keeps meticulous clinical notes, because if anything happens to me, to Vincent, or to his family, those notes will tell a very clear story about exactly who benefits from his continued suffering. Something flickered behind Dominic's eyes, not fear exactly, but a recalculation. The look of a man encountering more resistance than he'd anticipated. You're braver than I expected, Doctor. I'll give you that. He stepped back, smoothing his jacket, the predatory energy folding itself back into civility with practiced ease. I hope, for your sake, that bravery doesn't outlast your usefulness to this family. Things have a way of becoming complicated for people who outlive their purpose. He returned to his car without another word, and Elena stood alone in the parking garage for a long moment, her hands shaking now that there was no one left to perform composure for, the threat in his final words settling into her chest like ice water. She called Vincent before she'd even left the garage. He found me, she said, the moment he answered. Dominic, in the parking garage. He knows about us, not the details, but enough. He threatened me, Vincent, carefully, in a way that would never hold up as a threat in any court, but I know what I heard. The silence on the other end of the line was absolute, and when Vincent finally spoke, his voice had gone to a register she hadn't heard before, low, controlled, and utterly without warmth. Are you safe right now? I'm in my car. I'm fine. Go home. Lock your doors. I'm sending 2 men to watch your building tonight, and I don't want to hear an argument about it. A pause, and when he spoke again, something underneath the control cracked, just slightly. I should never have let this happen. I should have kept you out of this family entirely. You didn't let anything happen, Vincent. I chose this. I'm choosing it now. Her hands had finally stopped shaking, replaced by something steadier, something close to resolve. But I think we both need to understand that Dominic isn't going to wait patiently while you finish your exit plan on your own timeline. He's already moving. We need to move faster. Vincent called an emergency meeting that night, not with his uncle, not with the wider family, but with the small circle of people he had decided, after careful consideration, that he could actually trust. Rousseau, Sophia, and, after a long moment of hesitation that Elena understood and didn't take personally, herself. They gathered in the study, the lamp turned low, the city beyond the windows glittering with its usual indifference to the quiet desperation unfolding 11 floors above the street. I've been thinking about this wrong, Vincent said, pacing the length of the room in a way Elena hadn't seen from him before. Not the contained stillness of their sessions, but something closer to the restless energy of a man finally allowing himself to plan instead of merely endure. I've been trying to walk away quietly, gradually, wind things down without making waves, hoping Dominic would accept it as inevitable rather than fight it. That's not going to work. Today proved that. He's not going to let me leave slowly. The only way out is fast, and it's going to require leverage. What kind of leverage? Rousseau asked, his expression grave. My father kept records. Vincent stopped pacing, looked at each of them in turn. Not the kind that get filed with accountants, the kind he used to keep certain people loyal, men who'd betray him if they thought they could get away with it, kept in line by the knowledge that he had proof of exactly what they'd done over the years. Insurance, he called it. I know where it's kept. I've never used it, because using it meant admitting I might need protection from my own family. But I think the time for that particular pride is over. You're talking about blackmailing your own uncle, Elena said carefully. I'm talking about survival, Vincent said, meeting her eyes. Dominic has spent 4 years consolidating power while I was too broken to notice. If I walk into a room and try to simply announce my retirement, he kills me within the month and tells everyone it was a heart attack. The same story they used for my father. May he rest exactly as uneasily as he deserves. The only way I walk out of this alive is if Dominic understands that hurting me costs him more than letting me go. What's in the records? Sophia asked quietly. Enough to end most of the men currently running operations under this family, Dominic included, Vincent said. Federal charges, not family business. My father was thorough. He documented things specifically so that if anyone ever moved against him, he'd have a weapon that didn't require violence to use. A grim, humorless smile crossed his face. It's almost funny in a way. The same paranoid cruelty that made him a monster as a father might be the thing that saves his grandson from growing up the way I did. This is dangerous, Vincent, Rousseau said. If Dominic finds out you're planning to use those records before you actually have leverage secured, he won't wait for explanations. He'll move against you immediately. I know. Vincent's jaw was tight. That's why we need to move carefully, and we need to move soon. I want the records secured within the week. I want a meeting with Dominic where I lay out exactly what happens if anything happens to me, to Sophia, to the baby, or to— his eyes found Elena's— to anyone else I care about. And then I want out. Completely. A new name, if it comes to that, a new city. Whatever it takes to build the life I promised my son before he's even born. And me? Elena asked. Where do I fit into this plan, Vincent? Because if this is the moment where you tell me it's safer if I disappear from your life entirely, I want you to know, I've already decided that's not a conversation I'm willing to have. Something in his face softened, even amid the tension of the room. No, he said. That's not what I was going to say. I was going to ask if you'd consider coming with us. Not now, not until this is finished and it's safe. But after, if you'd still want that. If everything we've talked about is still true, once the danger is gone. Ask me again when it's actually safe, Elena said, though her voice carried no doubt in it at all. And I'll give you the answer you already know. Rousseau cleared his throat, the practical voice in a room suddenly thick with emotion neither of its principal characters had quite earned the right to indulge yet. not with so much danger still circling. I'll start arranging access to the records tomorrow. Quietly. If Dominic gets wind of this before we're ready, we lose our only advantage. What about me? Sophia asked. What do you need from me? Stay visible, Vincent said. Stay exactly as you've always been. The dutiful wife, uninvolved in business, focused entirely on the pregnancy. Dominic needs to believe nothing has changed in this house except my exhaustion. The moment he suspects we're organising against him, the timeline collapses and we lose whatever window we have left. The meeting broke up an hour later, Rousseau and Sophia leaving with careful, separate timing to avoid drawing attention, until only Elena and Vincent remained in the study, the city dark and glittering beyond the windows, the weight of everything they'd just set in motion settling heavy in the quiet room. Are you frightened? Elena asked. Terrified, Vincent admitted, surprising her with the honesty of it. Not for myself. I made my peace with my own mortality a long time ago, the night I was 16, if I'm honest about it. But for Sophia, for the baby, for you. He crossed the room, stopping close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating off him, close enough that the careful distance they'd maintained for weeks now felt almost unbearable. I've spent my whole life being afraid of what I might become. This is the first time I've been afraid of what I might lose instead. I don't know which fear is worse. The second one, Elena said softly, reaching up to rest her palm against his jaw, the first time she had touched him with anything other than the careful, clinical hands of a therapist. The first one you can heal. The second one just means you've finally found something worth being afraid for. He turned his face into her palm, his eyes closing, and for a long moment neither of them moved, the whole charged weight of 2 months of careful restraint gathering in that single point of contact like a held breath finally allowed to release. Eleanor, he said, her name rough in his throat. I am trying very hard to be the man who waits, the one who does this right, who protects you by keeping his distance until it's safe. But I don't know how much longer I can be that man. Then don't be, Eleanor said, and closed the last distance between them. The kiss, when it finally happened, was nothing like she had imagined in the quiet moments she'd refused to admit she'd spent imagining it. It wasn't hungry or desperate, though there was hunger underneath it, banked like coals beneath ash. It was careful, almost reverent, his hands framing her face with a gentleness that seemed entirely at odds with everything she knew about what those hands had done in his 16th year and many years since. And that contrast, that deliberate tenderness from a man capable of such violence, undid something in her more completely than passion alone could have. When they finally broke apart, his forehead rested against hers, both of them breathing unsteadily in the lamplit quiet of the study. I've wanted to do that since the night you sat in that chair and told me you weren't here to be analysed, Vincent said, his voice low, rough with restraint he was no longer entirely successful at maintaining. I think some part of me knew, even then, that whatever happened between us was going to matter more than I was prepared for. This complicates everything, Elena said, though she made no move to step back, her hands still resting against his chest, feeling the steady, unhurried rhythm of his heart. Steadier, she realised with something like wonder, than she'd ever felt it during their sessions. Everything was already complicated, Vincent said. I think we just stopped pretending otherwise. She should have left then. Every professional instinct she possessed told her to put distance between them immediately, to return to the careful architecture of doctor and patient that had protected them both for 2 months, to remember that the danger circling them was real and immediate, and that complicating their relationship further only gave Dominic more leverage to use. But she found, standing in the amber light of his study, with his hands still warm against her face, that she did not want to leave. And for the first time in 10 years, she allowed herself to want something more than she feared its cost. "Stay," Vincent said, as if reading the calculation happening behind her eyes. "Not for—" He paused, choosing his words with the same careful precision he brought to everything. "I'm not asking for anything beyond what you're ready to give. I just don't want this night to end yet. I've spent 5 years afraid of the dark, Eleanor. Tonight, for the first time, I'm not." She stayed. They didn't speak of business or danger or Dominic Moretti and the records his brother had hoarded like a dragon's treasure of insurance. Instead, they talked, really talked, for the first time without the structure of a therapy session shaping the conversation, about smaller things, human things. The books on his shelves and which ones he'd actually read twice. Her years in graduate school and the particular loneliness of being the only survivor in a family of 4. The buildings he used to draw in the margins of his schoolbooks and the ones he still, secretly, sketched, sometimes late at night when sleep wouldn't come. Blueprints for a life he'd never quite believed he'd be allowed to live. "Show me," Elena said when he mentioned the sketches, and he hesitated only a moment before retrieving a worn notebook from a locked drawer in his desk, handing it to her with the particular vulnerability of a man sharing something he'd never shown another living soul. The pages were filled with buildings, not fantastical, not impossible, but real, practical structures. Community centres, affordable housing complexes, a school with a courtyard designed to let in maximum natural light. Each drawing was annotated in careful, precise handwriting, notes about materials and sustainability, and the particular way good architecture could make people feel safe inside their own lives. "These are beautiful, Vincent," she said, and meant it completely. "You could actually build these. Once you're out, once it's safe, there's nothing stopping you from making this real." "I used to think there was nothing stopping me from being anything except who my father needed me to be," Vincent said quietly. "I'm starting to believe that might not be true anymore." He took the notebook back gently, his fingers brushing hers in the exchange, and something in the simple contact carried more weight than the kiss had somehow, the intimacy of being trusted with someone's unguarded hope. "I want to build something real, Elena. Not just buildings, a life. With you, if you'll still want that once all of this is finished." "Ask me when it's finished," she said again, though her voice had softened from the careful deflection it had carried earlier into something warmer, something closer to promise. "But Vincent, I think you should know that I'm not planning on changing my answer between now and then." He smiled at that, a real smile, unguarded, the kind she'd only glimpsed in fragments since their first meeting, and for a moment, sitting in the amber lamplight with the city glittering dangerously beyond the windows and his uncle somewhere in that same skyline calculating the cost of letting him live, Elena allowed herself to believe, just for a moment, that they might actually make it out the other side of all of this together. It was a moment she would remember, later, with the particular bitterness of hindsight, as the last truly peaceful hour either of them would have for a long time. The call came at 3 a.m., and Elena knew before she answered it that something had gone catastrophically wrong, because Vincent Moretti had never once called her at that hour in 2 months of treatment, not even during the worst of his episodes. Elena. His voice was different, stripped of its usual control, edged with something that sounded, for the first time since she'd known him, like genuine panic. Russo's missing. He went to retrieve the records 2 hours ago, and he hasn't checked in. Dominic's men were seen near the storage facility an hour before that. Elena was already out of bed, reaching for clothes, her own pulse hammering with an adrenaline that felt uncomfortably familiar. The old ghost of a diner on the south side rising up to meet this new danger, as if they were the same threat, wearing different clothes. What do you need me to do? Nothing. I need you to stay exactly where you are, lock your doors, and not open them for anyone except the 2 men I'm sending right now. His voice cracked slightly on the last word. I shouldn't have moved this fast. I shouldn't have. Helena, if Dominic has Russo, he knows about the records. He knows I'm planning to use them. That changes everything. What about Sophia? She's safe. I have 4 men with her, and she's not leaving the penthouse until this is resolved. A pause, heavy with things he wasn't saying. I'm going to find Russo. I'm going to fix this. Vincent, don't do anything reckless, please. We can call someone. There's no one to call, Elena. The police can't touch this family, and even if they could, calling them gets Russo killed faster, not slower. His voice had gone hard, cold, the version of him she'd seen flash across his face for just a moment at the nightclub, fully present now, fully armed. I have to go. Stay safe. I'll call you the moment I know something. The line went dead, and Elena stood in her dark apartment, fully dressed, her heart pounding, feeling for the first time the full, undeniable weight of what she had walked into. Not the abstract danger Russo had warned her about weeks ago, but something immediate and bloody and entirely capable of taking everything from her, exactly the way it had once before, in a diner that still visited her in dreams she'd never fully told anyone about. Not even Vincent. She did not stay where she was. She told herself, driving through empty streets toward the Gold Coast with her hands locked tight on the wheel, that she was not running toward danger out of some reckless need to prove she'd outgrown her own fear. She told herself she was going because Sophia was alone, frightened, 5 months pregnant, and Elena was, whatever else she might be in this complicated tangle of feeling and obligation, a doctor who did not abandon people in crisis. She told herself several things on that drive, and she believed perhaps half of them. The 2 men Vincent had sent to her apartment found her gone and called him immediately, and by the time she arrived at the penthouse, breathless, her hands shaking now that the adrenaline had nowhere left to go, Vincent was already there, his face white with a fury and fear so raw it took her aback. "What were you thinking?" he demanded, gripping her shoulders, his eyes searching her face for injury, for proof she was actually unhurt, actually real. "I told you to stay where you were." Sophia was alone. Sophia has 4 armed men. You had nothing. His hands tightened, not painfully, but with the desperate grip of a man who'd genuinely believed, for the 20 minutes it had taken her to drive across the city, that he might lose her. "Elena, do you understand what's happening?
Dominic has Russo. That means he has leverage, and the moment he understands you matter to me, and after tonight he will, because you just drove yourself directly into the heart of exactly the situation I was trying to keep you away from, you become leverage too.
I understand exactly what's happening, Elena said, her own voice shaking now, the fear finally catching up with her. I understand that you're standing here yelling at me instead of being relieved I'm not lying dead in my apartment because Dominic's men got there first instead of yours. I understand that I love you, Vincent, and that loving you apparently means I don't get the luxury of sitting safely on the sidelines while you go fight a war I have every reason to be terrified of. The fury drained out of his face all at once, replaced by something that looked almost like grief. You love me. I told you that 2 weeks ago. You told me you thought you were falling in love with me, he corrected quietly. There's a difference, and I notice the difference, Elena, even now, even with everything falling apart around us. Then let the record show, Elena said, her voice unsteady but certain, that I'm no longer falling. I've landed. I love you, completely, recklessly, against every piece of professional and personal judgment I've spent a decade building. And I am not leaving this building until I know Russo is safe and you are safe and we figure out together how to survive whatever your uncle is about to throw at us. Vincent pulled her against his chest, and she felt him shaking too, the controlled, dangerous man finally allowing himself, in the privacy of a quiet hallway at 4 a.m, to simply be afraid. I love you too, he said into her hair. I think I've loved you since the first night, when you sat across from me and told me you weren't here to be analysed, and I realised you were the first person in my entire life who looked at me and saw something other than a weapon or a target. Then we survive this, Elena said, and you build me one of those buildings from your notebook, the one with the courtyard. I want to watch you become the man you were always supposed to be, Vincent, not the one your father made. I want that too, he said, more than I've ever wanted anything. But first I have to find Russo, and I have to find him before Dominic decides he's not useful as a hostage anymore. Dominic's call came at dawn, routed through a burner phone to Vincent's private line, and Elena stood close enough to hear both sides of the conversation, her hand gripping Vincent's arm hard enough to leave marks. Nephew. Dominic's voice carried none of the urbane charm he'd shown Elena in the parking garage. It had stripped down to something colder, more businesslike. I trust you've had an eventful night. Where's Russo, Dominic? Comfortable, unharmed, for now. Though I should mention, for now, is doing quite a lot of work in that sentence, and how long it continues to apply depends entirely on you. A pause, the sound of ice in a glass. I understand you sent him to retrieve something of your father's, something with my name attached to it, among others. You should have left well enough alone, Dominic. Should I? Dominic's laugh was short, humourless. You were going to use my own brother's insurance against me, Vincent, against the family he built. I think leaving well enough alone was never going to be an option once you decided to play that particular hand. What do you want? I want what I've always wanted. This family run the way it was built to be run by someone with the stomach for it. I tried patience, Vincent. I tried letting you have your therapy, your healing, your little fantasy about walking away clean. I was content to let you fade into irrelevance while I handled the actual business of keeping this family alive. but you forced my hand by trying to destroy us instead of simply stepping aside. So this is a negotiation. This is a transaction. Dominic's voice hardened. You will sign over full operational control to me, formally, witnessed, irreversible. You will retire quietly, permanently, somewhere far from Chicago, and you will never speak to anyone, not the police, not the press, not your pretty little doctor, about anything you know regarding this family's business. In exchange, I let Russo live, and I let you and your wife and your unborn child leave this city with your lives intact. Vincent's jaw was tight, his free hand curling into a fist at his side. And if I refuse? Then Russo dies tonight, and I find other ways to convince you. Ways that will involve people you care about far more than a loyal employee. A pause, deliberate, cruel. I know about the doctor, Vincent. I've known for weeks. I'd hate for her research into trauma to become more personal than she'd prefer. The line went dead before Vincent could respond, and he stood frozen for a long moment, the phone still pressed to his ear, his whole body rigid with a fury so absolute it seemed to vibrate the air around him. He's threatening Elena directly, Vincent said finally, his voice flat, controlled in the particular way that frightened her more than shouting would have. He's not bluffing. Dominic doesn't make threats he isn't prepared to follow through on. Then we give him what he wants, Sophia said, emerging from the bedroom doorway, her face pale but composed, her hand resting protectively over her swollen belly. Vincent, sign whatever he wants signed. Walk away. Let him have the business. None of it matters if it costs Russo his life, or Elena's, or— It's not that simple, Vincent said, turning to face her. If I sign over control without leverage, I have no protection left. Dominic gets everything he wants and has no further reason to let any of us live. The records were never about destroying him. They were about ensuring he had a reason to let me walk away breathing. Then what's the plan? Elena asked, her voice steadier than she felt. Vincent was quiet for a long moment, something working behind his eyes, the careful, methodical calculation of a man who had spent his entire adult life navigating exactly this kind of impossible math. We give him what he thinks he wants, he said finally. We agree to the meeting. We bring the documents he thinks I'm planning to use against him. And we make sure that whatever happens in that room, there are people watching from outside it who will make sure none of us walk in there without a way to walk back out. That sounds like a trap within a trap, Eleanor said. It is, Vincent said grimly. The only kind of trap that's ever worked on a man like Dominic. The meeting was set for the following night, at a location Dominic chose with deliberate, symbolic cruelty. The same warehouse where, 18 years earlier, a 16-year-old Vincent Moretti had become, in his father's eyes, a man, and in his own private accounting, something closer to a ghost who'd been walking around in a body ever since. Elena was not supposed to be there. Vincent had argued fiercely for hours that she should be on a plane anywhere but Chicago, far from the blast radius of whatever was about to happen in that cold, cavernous building. But Elena had refused with an obstinance that surprised even her, and in the end it was Sophia who tipped the argument, pointing out, with the particular ruthless logic of a woman who had spent 5 years learning to survive in this world, that Dominic already knew about Elena, already considered her leverage, and that hiding her now would only confirm exactly how valuable she was, painting an even larger target on her back for whenever this current crisis resolved. Better she's somewhere we control the variables, Sophia had said. Better she's with people who'll protect her. than alone, somewhere Dominic's men can find her without witnesses. So Elena stood now in the shadows near a side entrance of the warehouse, flanked by two of Vincent's most trusted men, watching through a gap in old corrugated metal as Vincent walked alone into the centre of the floor, a leather satchel in his hand containing copies of the documents that constituted his only real leverage. The originals secured somewhere only Sophia and Rousseau's most trusted second knew the location of. Dominic was already waiting, flanked by 4 men, and between them, zip-tied to a chair, his face bruised, but his eyes alert, was Rousseau, alive, which loosened something tight in Elena's chest, though the relief was thin, fragile, contingent on everything that happened in the next several minutes. "Nephew," Dominic's voice echoed in the cavernous space, "I'm pleased you came alone, as agreed." "I came as agreed," Vincent said, his voice carrying the particular flat calm Elena had come to recognize as his most dangerous register. "Let Rousseau go, then we talk." "Documents first." "Rousseau first," Vincent said. "I'm not negotiating the order, Dominic. You wanted this meeting. These are my terms for showing up." A long, tense silence stretched across the warehouse floor, the kind of silence that Elena, watching from her hidden vantage point, felt in her teeth, in the old, half-healed scar tissue of her own trauma. Every cell in her body screaming the ancient warning that this was exactly the kind of room where her family had died, exactly the kind of silence that preceded gunfire. Finally, Dominic gestured, and one of his men cut Rousseau's restraints. Rousseau stumbled to his feet, bruised but mobile, and made his way slowly toward Vincent's side of the room, his eyes scanning for exits with the same trained efficiency Elena had seen in Vincent 100 times now. "Now," Dominic said, "the documents." Vincent opened the satchel, removed a thick folder, and held it out, not toward Dominic, but toward the open space between them, forcing his uncle to step forward to claim it. "These are copies," Vincent said. "The originals are secured elsewhere, with instructions to release them to federal authorities if anything happens to me, to my wife, to my child, or to anyone else I care about. This isn't a surrender, Dominic. This is insurance against you doing exactly what you're planning to do the moment you think you don't need me anymore." Dominic's expression flickered. Surprise quickly schooled into something colder. "You think you can outmaneuver me in my own business, boy?" "I think my father taught me everything he taught you," Vincent said, "and I think you've spent so long underestimating me as broken that you forgot I was raised by the same man who built this entire empire on the principle of never leaving yourself without leverage." The air in the warehouse had gone electric, charged with a violence that hadn't yet erupted, but felt, to Elena watching from the shadows, entirely inevitable. The particular held breath quality of a room where everyone present understood that someone was about to die, the only question being who. It was Dominic who moved first. His hand went to his jacket, fast, practiced, and Elena's entire body locked, rigid with terror, as she watched the scene unfold in the slow, distorted time of pure adrenaline. Vincent's own hand moving simultaneously, his men emerging from positions she hadn't even known existed around the warehouse's edges, the sudden eruption of shouted commands, and the unmistakable, gut-dropping sound of a gun being drawn. She didn't think. She moved. "Vincent!" The word tore out of her before her mind had fully processed what she was seeing. Dominic's gun rising, finding its target not on Vincent, but on Rousseau. the calculation in Dominic's eyes suddenly horribly clear. Kill the witness first, force chaos, use it to finish what he'd started. Vincent moved faster than thought, throwing himself between Dominic's gun and Rousseau's exposed position, and the warehouse erupted into chaos. Gunfire, shouting, the particular percussive violence Elena had spent 18 years trying to outrun, finally, inevitably, catching up with her in the very heart of the place that had birthed it for someone else, 18 years before, in almost this exact spot. The gunfire lasted less than 30 seconds, though Elena would later be unable to convince herself it had taken any less than several lifetimes. The particular dilation of time that violence always seemed to produce, stretching seconds into something almost geological, every detail seared into memory with horrible, permanent clarity. When it stopped, the silence that followed was somehow worse. Elena was moving before the echo of the last shot had finished rolling through the warehouse's vast emptiness, ignoring the shouted warnings of the men beside her, running across the open floor toward the place where Vincent had fallen, her mind refusing entirely to process the possibility that she might be running toward exactly the kind of loss she had spent 10 years building her entire life to avoid. He was alive. The relief that crashed through her at the sight of his chest still rising and falling was so absolute it nearly buckled her knees. But it was tempered immediately by the spreading dark stain across his shoulder. The pain etched into his face as he tried, unsuccessfully, to push himself upright. "Don't move," Elena said, dropping to her knees beside him, her hands already pressing firm against the wound with the steady, practiced competence of a woman whose worst day had once required exactly this kind of pressure, exactly this kind of desperate arithmetic between blood loss and time. "Vincent, look at me. Stay with me." "Rousseau," he managed, his voice tight with pain. "Is he? He's fine. He's fine. You got there in time." She kept her hands pressed firm against his shoulder, blood warm and slick under her palms, the smell of it, copper, immediate, terrible, pulling her back for one vertiginous moment to a diner on the south side before she forced herself, with the same discipline that had built an entire career, back into the present. "Dominic?" "Down!" Rousseau's voice answered from somewhere behind her, rough but steady. "2 of his men with him. We lost one of ours." A pause, heavy with grief that would need its own reckoning later, in some quieter moment that wasn't this one. "It's over, Vincent. It's actually over." Vincent's eyes found Elena's, even through the pain, even through the chaos still settling around them, men shouting into phones, the distant sound of approaching sirens that someone had clearly anticipated and prepared a story for, the particular controlled aftermath of violence in a world that had learned over generations how to clean up after itself. "I told you," he said, his voice fading, "I'd build something. Don't let me. Don't let this be how it ends, Elena. Not after everything." "You're not dying," Elena said fiercely, pressing harder against the wound, willing it to be true through sheer force of will. "Do you understand me, Vincent Moretti? You promised me a building with a courtyard. I intend to collect on that promise, so you do not get to die in this warehouse 18 years after the worst night of your life. You hear me?" Something that might have been a laugh, weak and pained, escaped him. "Bossy," he managed. "Even now. Especially now,
Eleanor said, and held on, hand steady despite the trembling she felt everywhere else, holding the man she loved together with the same desperate, stubborn competence that had once, 18 years ago, failed to save anyone at all, and was now, finally, against every fear she had carried since that day, succeeding. The ambulance arrived 9 minutes later, 9 minutes that felt, to Eleanor, like the entirety of her adult life compressed into a single unbearable span, and she rode with him to the hospital, refusing every suggestion that she step back and let the paramedics work, her hand locked in his the entire way, both of them silent, both of them holding on with everything they had left.
He came out of surgery 4 hours later, the bullet removed cleanly from his shoulder, the prognosis good, the particular miracle of modern trauma medicine doing what 18 years of his own body's vigilance had never quite managed to ensure, keeping him alive long enough to actually have a future worth fighting for. Elena sat beside his hospital bed as he slept, finally, deeply, without the fractured, watchful sleep of a man perpetually braced for danger, and understood, watching the steady rise and fall of his chest, that something fundamental had shifted in the warehouse that night, not just in the balance of power within the Moretti family, but in the architecture of his own mind, the place where 5 years of unbroken vigilance had finally, perhaps, found something worth the rest. The official story, when it finally settled into something resembling public record, involved a warehouse fire, an accident, 2 unfortunate deaths attributed to faulty wiring and worse luck, the particular alchemy by which a family like the Morettis turned bloodshed into bureaucratic footnote, a skill passed down through generations like a family recipe, except the ingredients were silence and money, and the careful cultivation of friends in places that mattered. Elena understood, watching it unfold over the following weeks, that this was a world with its own physics, its own gravity, entirely separate from the one she'd spent her adult life believing in, a world where consequences could be managed, narratives controlled, the truth itself negotiated like any other asset. It should have frightened her more than it did. Perhaps, she thought, sitting beside Vincent's hospital bed in the quiet pre-dawn hours, while machines monitored his careful recovery, she had simply run out of capacity for new fear, having spent it all in a single terrible night that had, in its own brutal way, finally exorcised something that had lived in her chest for 18 years. Dominic was dead. 2 of his lieutenants with him, the men who'd remained loyal to Vincent through the long, uncertain years of his illness, had moved quickly and decisively in the aftermath, consolidating what remained of the operation under terms Vincent himself dictated from his hospital bed, with a clarity that surprised even Russo. Terms that involved, over the following 18 months, a careful, deliberate dismantling of everything dangerous, everything illegal, everything his father and grandfather had built on threat and blood, replaced by legitimate businesses that could survive in daylight, that didn't require a man to check his exits every time he walked into a room. "It won't happen overnight," Vincent told her, 3 days after the surgery, his voice still weak, but his eyes clear in a way she hadn't seen since their first meeting. "Some of it will take years. The construction company, the restaurants, those convert easily enough. The rest will need more patience than I've ever had for anything." "You have time now," Elena said, holding his hand, careful of the IV line still taped to the back of it. "That's the part that's changed, Vincent. You're not racing against your own mortality anymore. You're not bracing for the moment Dominic decides you're more useful dead. You actually have time to build this slowly, The right way. Because of you, he said. All of it. Because of you. The treatment, the courage to even imagine an exit, the actual physical fact of being alive right now instead of bleeding out on that warehouse floor. He turned his hand to lace his fingers through hers. I keep thinking about something you said, that first night, that you weren't here for a fairy tale, that I had to actually walk away, not just want to. I think I finally understand what you meant. The wanting was never the hard part. The walking is. You're walking, Elena said softly. One step at a time, but you're walking. That's all any of us can ask of ourselves. He was discharged 10 days later, the wound healing clean, and Elena drove him home herself, not to the penthouse, but to a smaller, quieter house Sophia had found weeks earlier on a tree-lined street far from the Gold Coast, the kind of unremarkable, comfortable home that belonged to no particular narrative about power or danger, just a family preparing for a baby and a future neither of its parents had been certain they'd survive to see. The months that followed unfolded with a quietness Elena had nearly forgotten was possible. Ordinary days, ordinary worries, the particular mundane miracle of a life no longer organized entirely around the management of crisis. She continued seeing Vincent professionally for a time, though the sessions changed character, became less about managing acute symptoms and more about the slower, deeper work of rebuilding an identity that had spent 18 years organized around violence and now had to learn what it meant to simply be a man, a husband, though that particular word had taken on new and complicated meaning, a father. A person with ordinary days ahead of him instead of a countdown clock he'd stopped believing he'd survive. Sophia gave birth in early autumn, a healthy boy they named Matteo, after Vincent's grandfather, not Salvatore, never Salvatore, a deliberate severing of the family's violent inheritance even in the smallest details. Elena was there at the hospital, not as Vincent's doctor, and not yet, officially, as anything with a name, but as someone who had become, in the strange architecture of this particular found family, essential enough that no one thought to question her presence in the waiting room, pacing alongside Vincent through the long hours of labour, holding his hand when his own fear, a different kind now, the ordinary terror of impending fatherhood rather than the trauma-soaked dread of his nightmares, threatened to overwhelm him. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted, somewhere around hour 11, his voice raw with exhaustion and something that looked almost like wonder. "I never had anyone show me what a good father looks like. I have no template for this, except the one I'm trying desperately not to copy." "You don't need a template," Elena said. "You need to show up, every day, imperfectly, the way every parent who's ever loved a child has shown up. That's the whole secret, Vincent. There isn't a manual. There's just choosing, over and over, to do better than what was done to you." When Matteo was finally placed in Vincent's arms, small and red-faced and furious at the indignity of being born, Elena watched something settle in him. Some final piece of the armour he'd worn since he was 16 years old, finally completely falling away, replaced by an expression of such naked, unguarded love that she had to look away for a moment, overwhelmed by the privilege of witnessing it. "He's perfect," Vincent whispered, and Elena, watching him hold his son for the first time, understood that whatever came next for the three of them, for the four of them, if she allowed herself to count herself among the architecture of this new family being built, would be built on something entirely different than the foundation that had shaped Vincent's own childhood. Not violence, not fear. Something closer, she thought, to the careful, deliberate construction of his own hand-drawn buildings, designed from the ground up to let in light. Sophia, exhausted but radiant, looked over at Elena from the hospital bed with an expression that carried no jealousy, no complication, only a kind of weary, grateful warmth. "Thank you for being here," she said quietly. "For all of it. I don't think either of us would have made it to this room without you." "You'd have found a way," Elena said. "Both of you. You're stronger than you know." "Maybe," Sophia allowed. "But I'm glad we didn't have to find out." The custody arrangement that followed, in the months after Matteo's birth, was unconventional by any traditional standard. Sophia and Vincent, never having been in love in the way the world assumed marriage required, settled into a careful, respectful co-parenting arrangement, divorcing quietly and without acrimony, each finding their own way forward while remaining bound together by their shared devotion to their son. Sophia, in time, found her own happiness with a man entirely outside the world Vincent had spent his life trying to escape. A professor of art history she met at a gallery opening, gentle and unburdened by any of the violence that had shaped her first marriage. And Elena, slowly, carefully, without the rush or recklessness that danger had once demanded of her relationship with Vincent, began building something with him that had room enough for all of it. For Matteo's small, demanding presence in their lives, for the complicated, ongoing work of dismantling an empire built on blood, for the quiet, ordinary intimacy of two people who had found in each other proof that even the deepest wounds could become, eventually, the foundation for something worth surviving for. 2 years after the warehouse, on a bright September morning with the lake wind carrying the particular sharp, hopeful smell of a Chicago autumn, Elena stood beside Vincent at the edge of a construction site on the south side, watching the first steel beams of his community center rise against a blue sky. It had taken 18 months of careful, patient work to convert the Moretti family's remaining legitimate assets into the foundation for something entirely new. A non-profit housing and community development initiative that Vincent ran now with the same meticulous attention he'd once brought to far darker work, channeling decades of organizational skill and resource management into something that built instead of destroyed. The community center, his first major project, would include affordable housing units, a health clinic, and, at its heart, exactly the kind of light-filled courtyard he'd sketched in the margins of his schoolbooks as a boy, the one Elena had promised in a hospital room 2 years earlier that she intended to collect on. "It's actually happening," Vincent said, his voice carrying a wonder that had become, over the past 2 years, one of her favourite things about him, the slow, accumulating astonishment of a man discovering, piece by piece, that the life he'd dreamed about as a child was not, in fact, permanently out of reach. "Did you ever doubt it would?" Elena asked, slipping her hand into his. "Every single day," he admitted, with the particular honesty that had become the bedrock of their relationship, the thing she'd insisted on from their very first session, and that he had, eventually, learned to offer without flinching. "I spent so many years believing I didn't have the right to build anything, that men like me only get to destroy. It took a long time to unlearn that, Elena, longer than I think either of us expected." "You're still unlearning it," she said gently. "That's not a criticism, it's just true. Some wounds take longer than 2 years." "I know," he squeezed her hand. "But I'm not unlearning it alone anymore. That's the part that makes the difference. They had married the previous spring, a small, quiet ceremony attended by a carefully chosen handful of people. Sophia and her professor holding 3-year-old Matteo between them. Russo, who had become, over the years, something closer to family than employee, standing as Vincent's best man with a gruff pride he tried unsuccessfully to hide. A handful of Elena's own colleagues and the small, careful circle of friends she'd allowed back into her life over the years since the diner had taken almost everyone else. Elena had given up her private practice, though not her work entirely. She now ran a foundation, funded in part by Vincent's reorganized resources, dedicated to trauma treatment for survivors of violence, training therapists in the specific techniques that had once helped her find her way back to herself, and later helped her find a way to help Vincent find his own way back from the particular darkness his father had forced him into at 16. It was work that honoured both halves of her own history, the wound and the healing, the woman who had survived a diner and the woman who had walked against every instinct her trauma had built into a penthouse belonging to a man the world called a monster, and found instead someone capable of being saved. "Do you ever think about that first night?" Vincent asked, watching the construction crew below them maneuver another beam into place. "Standing at that window, the first time I turned around and saw you." "All the time," Elena admitted. "I think about how certain I was that I'd made a terrible mistake agreeing to even one consultation. How sure I was that I understood exactly what kind of danger I was walking into." "And were you right?" "About the danger?" Elena considered the question seriously, watching the steel skeleton of the building rise against the sky, the future taking shape, one careful beam at a time. "Yes, actually, I was right about that. It was dangerous, Vincent. More dangerous than I let myself fully admit, even to you, for a long time. But I was wrong about what kind of danger it would turn out to be. I thought I was risking my safety. What I was actually risking was my certainty. The whole careful architecture I'd built to keep myself safe from ever caring about anyone enough to be hurt again." She turned to look at him. The man who had once terrified her with his exhaustion and his history and the particular weight of violence he carried in his bones, now standing beside her, with nothing in his eyes but quiet, settled love. Turns out that was a risk worth taking. That night, after the construction crew had gone home and the autumn light had faded into the particular deep blue of a Chicago evening, Eleanor and Vincent sat together on the back porch of the house they shared, the same quiet, tree-lined house Sophia had found for them years earlier, now repainted and refurnished into something entirely their own. With a small garden Elena had insisted on, the kind of ordinary domestic detail that had once seemed impossibly far from the trajectory of either of their lives. Matteo was with Sophia that weekend, and the house carried the particular stillness of two people who had earned the right to simply exist together, without urgency, without crisis, without the constant, vigilant calculation that had once defined every hour of Vincent's life. "Do you still have the dreams?" Elena asked, watching the last light fade over their small backyard. The question one she asked occasionally, gently, never with the clinical precision of their original sessions, but with the ongoing, careful attention of a partner who understood that healing was never a single completed event, but a continuing practice. "Sometimes," Vincent admitted. "Not the version with Matteo anymore. That one stopped a long time ago, somewhere around his 2nd birthday. though I couldn't tell you exactly when it shifted. He was quiet for a moment, considering. Sometimes I still dream about the warehouse, the first one, from when I was 16. But it's different now. I wake up, and it takes me a few seconds to remember where I am, and then I remember, and the fear passes faster than it used to. It doesn't own the whole night anymore, just a few minutes of it. That's what recovery actually looks like, Elena said softly. Not the absence of the wound. The wound stops running the show. You taught me that, he said, among about 1,000 other things. You taught yourself, Elena corrected gently. I just held the door open, remember? You're the one who walked through it. Every single day for 2 years, you walked through it. That's not nothing, Vincent. That's the hardest work a person can do. He reached over and took her hand, his thumb moving gently over her knuckles, in the gesture that had become, over the years, as familiar to her as her own heartbeat. I think about the diner sometimes, he said quietly. Your diner. You've never told me everything that happened that day, and I've never asked. Because I understand what it costs to be asked before you're ready. But I think about it, because I think it's the reason you understood me when no one else could. You knew what it cost to survive something that should have destroyed you. You knew that healing isn't about forgetting or even forgiving necessarily. It's about learning to carry the weight differently. Helena was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the darkening garden, feeling the old, familiar weight of that day settle in her chest. Not gone, never entirely gone, but lighter now than it had been in years, carried alongside something new, something that had grown up beside the grief instead of trying to replace it. I was 26, she said finally, the words coming slower than she expected, but coming nonetheless, offered freely for the first time in years to someone who had earned the right to hear them. We were having dinner, an ordinary Tuesday. My father was telling a story. I don't even remember what it was about anymore. Isn't that strange? I've spent 10 years trying to remember, and I can't. Just that he was laughing and reaching for the salt, and then... She stopped, steadied herself, continued. 3 men came in. I never found out why. The police investigated for 2 years and never found a motive, never found the men, nothing. Just 3 minutes of violence that took my parents and my younger brother and left me sitting on a diner floor holding my father's hand while it stopped being warm. Vincent said nothing, simply held her hand, present in the particular way she had learned over years of practice was the most valuable thing anyone could offer grief. Not solutions, not platitudes, just presence, steady and unflinching. I built my whole career out of that day, Eleanor continued. I told myself I was helping people, and I was. That part was always true. But I think underneath it, I was also trying to understand something that never had an explanation. Trying to find meaning in something that was just senseless, random violence that took everyone I loved and left me standing, for no reason I've ever been able to identify. She turned to look at him, the man who had once represented, in the abstract, everything she'd spent her life trying to avoid, and who had become, instead, the person who understood her most completely. And then I met you, and for the first time, the violence had a face I could actually look at, a history I could actually trace, a reason, even if the reason was terrible, even if it never excused what came after. I think some part of me needed that, Vincent, needed to finally look violence in the eye instead of just treating its aftermath from a careful, clinical distance. "I'm sorry," Vincent said quietly, "that I represented that for you. I'm sorry any part of loving me required you to confront something so painful." "Don't be," Elena said, shaking her head. "That's not what I'm telling you. I'm telling you that loving you didn't reopen the wound, Vincent. It helped me finally close it. Watching you fight your way out of the very world that made the men who killed my family, watching you choose every single day to be something different than what you were raised to be. That healed something in me that 10 years of treating other people's trauma never managed to touch." He pulled her close then, and they sat together in the deepening dark, the small garden settling into night around them, two survivors of different but related violence, who had found, against every reasonable expectation, a way to build something steady and real out of the wreckage both their lives had once seemed destined to remain. "Matteo asked me last week what I used to do," Vincent said after a long, comfortable silence. "Before the foundation, before the construction company. He's getting old enough to start asking questions." "What did you tell him?" "I told him his father used to be lost, and that someone helped him find his way home." Vincent pressed a kiss to the top of her head, his voice rough with a particular emotion that still, after 2 years, caught him by surprise sometimes. Gratitude so large it felt almost like grief. The strange, overwhelming weight of a happiness he'd never expected to survive long enough to claim. "I told him that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do isn't fighting. It's choosing to put down the weapon and build something instead, even when everyone around you says that's impossible." "That's a good answer," Eleanor said softly. "I had a good teacher," Vincent said, and in the gathering dark of their quiet garden, in the small, ordinary miracle of a life built carefully out of 2 people's worst days, Eleanor Marchetti, who had once sworn she would never again involve herself with violence or the people who caused it, who had built an entire fortress of professional distance to keep herself safe from exactly this kind of risk, understood that she had found, finally, after 10 years of careful, solitary survival, something larger and more durable than safety. She had found a home. Not despite the darkness both of them carried, but built deliberately, brick by careful brick, directly on top of it. Proof, if either of them had ever needed it, that even the deepest violence could not have the final word. Not when 2 people chose every single day to answer it with something stronger.